perhaps no surprise that the person we're talking to about Saint Ignatius of Antioch is Reverend Frank Ritchie. Frank, kia ora, how are you?
Kia ora, I'm doing really well. I've just recently I read his writings many years ago. Saint Ignatius of Antioch, he wrote 7 letters to the church, but I recently dove back in along with Clement of Rome and Polycarp. These are the
Okay.
kind of first generation after the apostles. And as you mentioned, Ignatius, taught by John himself, hung out with
Wow.
John. I believe Polycarp did as well. So if you want to get a handle on how the early church viewed itself, and what the apostles had handed on. These are the guys to be reading.
And it's amazing, yeah, you're talking about the 7 letters. Now, that's got a familiar ring, of course, to it because the 7 letters in the book of Revelation and, well, pretty much most of the New Testament is letters to the churches, encouraging them in their faith. And it's interesting to put this in the broader perspective. This didn't just stop when this was a tradition which continued throughout the early church. There was still missionary involvement. There were still letters of encouragement written on points of theology.
Yeah, and the letters of Clement and Ignatius in particular, there were debates in the early church about whether they should be included in Scripture. I mean,
Yeah.
if we talk about Ignatius's 7 letters, where if you date Revelation as being written relatively early,
Hmm.
then Ignatius's letters only come decades later. We're
Yeah.
talking probably somewhere between 98 and 110 AD. So we're talking really early, and those 7 letters were written while he was on his way to Rome. And he wasn't going from Antioch to Rome because he wanted a holiday in Rome. He hadn't booked some Airbnb or something and is going to spend a few days doing all the tourist stuff. He was on his way to Rome because he'd been arrested due to his faith
Hmm.
and was heading to the Colosseum where he was going to be killed. So he on his way, he was visited by bishops from other churches, and so he wrote to those churches. But one of the ones that I love the most is his writing to the church in Rome,
Hmm.
which in his view seem to hold some sort of preeminence. But when he's talking to the faithful in Rome, he clearly thinks there's a risk. And I use the word risk because it'd be his view,
Yeah.
a risk that they might stop him from going to the Colosseum to be killed, that they might
Wow.
kind of intervene and intercede to the Roman authorities so that he doesn't have to be slaughtered. And he encourages them to not do it, to
Wow.
do everything that they can to resist that temptation because he really wants to go to the Colosseum and die as a martyr. It's fascinating.
This is very countercultural. Of course, I mean, I'm sure it would have been then. Here's a guy on his way to be ripped apart by lions saying, whatever you do, don't try and stop this happening. Although putting it in the context of his own theological training, John, of course, the only surviving apostle, all of the other apostles who spent time with Jesus had died horrific deaths. This was part of
Yeah.
his legacy, part of the training he was brought up on.
Yeah, so as someone in that very early generation who takes his faith very seriously, the models he has seen are first Jesus, who
Yeah.
dies a death on the cross. Then all of his other heroes have all died gruesome deaths as faithful disciples of Jesus. So if you want to be kind of counted among them, in his mind, this is how you go out.
Yeah.
This is how you get close to God. This is how you're assured of being with Christ in paradise. So why would you do anything to stop that? And I just found it hugely confronting to a degree. The nature of how he, and then when I read a whole bunch of other early Christians, how they understood suffering.
Yeah.
Suffering as a thing that draws you closer to God. And when I look at my own approach to suffering and pain and hardship, I find myself in a very different place from them. I find myself, and I see so many others of faith that here in the West, where things are relatively comfortable, suffering is the thing that often pushes us away from God. It causes doubt. And I'm like, what has gone on in my world that sees it so differently from someone like Ignatius? I would not pursue. I would want everybody to do everything they could to stop that if I was in his shoes.
And I suppose part of the cultural change, some people might think that prosperity and the pursuit of happiness is in the Bible. No, that's in the US Constitution. And maybe putting that as our key priority, whatever we need to do for a quiet, comfortable, affluent life where we're happy, if that's our priority, then some of the spiritual disciplines go down the list, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so I'm asking some questions about myself now. Like I read Ignatius many years ago when I was studying theology, and I thought it was interesting. But this time around, it's really landed for me just how very different his view of the faith was. And that doesn't mean I'm going to go out and do everything I can to pursue martyrdom.
Yeah,
It happened for him because ultimately he was faithful to Christ no matter what.
yeah.
That's the question that I need to start asking myself. And then start asking myself some questions too of how I respond when life gets hard. What happens when I feel like I'm going through a little bit of suffering, whatever that looks like? Does it push me towards God or does it push me away? And if it's not drawing me towards God, then I need to reshape my thinking somehow.
I think there's the difference there between I suppose, the ascetic lifestyle to say, no, I'm going to, flagellate myself or whatever, that I'm going to cause myself to be in pain. I'm going to take steps to deny the flesh, because we get into some ropey theology there. But this is quite a different thing, and there's an important distinction here, I think, that accepting pain, accepting suffering as part of God's providence, but not necessarily seeking that out for yourself.
Yeah, and when I look around the world, like I think back to my years when I worked at Tier Fund and was in communities overseas where people really did struggle and really did suffer, but I saw the depth of faith, the love of Jesus in those situations, and it was again, it was just a seeing the hardship through a different lens, as
Yeah.
opposed to pursuing the hardship, because poverty is something that should be fought against,
Hmm.
but rather than kind of seeing it as something that causes us to think that God's not there, they saw it as a way to allow their faith to be shaped.
Mm.
What I love as well about Ignatius is in a world at the moment where things seem a bit bereft. They're all over the place. The world is chaotic. And I think people need somewhere to be grounded with deep meaning. I look at someone like Ignatius and I'm like, man, you've got the disciples and you've got Jesus and you've got our biblical characters. But in terms of working out what it looks like in something like the Roman Empire,
Yeah.
a world bereft of God, there's a hero to follow.
Certainly. Now, I know this is something which you've done beforehand, Frank, to write your own epistle, as it were, like the epistles that are in the Bible, and perhaps like Saint Ignatius as well, to write a letter to the church. Now, this is something you have done in the past, haven't you? This is something you've done now. I suppose, but following on from what you've learnt from these letters, what would you say to the church today, particularly the church in the West, in Aotearoa, New Zealand? What message would you want to convey to the church from what you've learnt from Saint Ignatius?
Yeah, I would say we need to be very aware of the sea that we swim in and how it shapes us, how it forms us, and therefore how we decide what's good and what's bad, what is an example of faithfulness and what isn't, and critique it and start to look back at some of the heroes of the faith like Ignatius and go, what was different about them? Why did they think differently? And how can I follow that and therefore follow Jesus more faithfully rather than just taking on the good and the bad of the culture around me?
Hey, appreciate your thoughts on Saint Ignatius, and would encourage people. I mean, Google the guy. Honestly, even if it's
Yes.
Wikipedia, some such depth from the early church fathers. Frank, appreciate the work that you do. Thank you for your ministry. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.